snow fell with a slow, relentless patience, softening the world until tents and standards and the dark backs of huddled horses became dim shapes in a white shroud. The fires of the camp beat back the cold only in ragged circles of orange. Beyond them, the fields rolled away toward Winterfell's low, black silhouette, its towers like blunt knuckles pressed against the pale sky. The godswood that stood on a rise east of the camp whispered with ice. There, beneath the red leaves of a heart tree and the weeping face cut into its trunk, Jon knelt with his gloved hands open upon his knees and his breath rising faintly. Ghost paced the treeline, a white shadow within white, quiet but watchful, as if the earth had grown itself a spirit made of snow and old longing. The hush inside the godswood was different than the hush over the camp. It was a breathing kind of silence, deep as roots, and it had never felt stranger to him than now. He had always knelt as a snow. The tree had looked upon him as a bastard of Winterfell, the son of an honorable man's failure or mercy, depending on which whisper you believed and how much wine you'd swallowed. He had offered the words of the old gods with a bastard's voice. The tree had listened. It had accepted him. It was the only thing that ever had without question. The steps on frost came soft and careful. Jon did not turn until Sansa's fur brushed the bark, her hood an auburn halo damp with melt. The color of her hair in the dimness made him think of the leaf stains on the snow beneath the face. Red, but not blood. "You asked for me?" she said, her voice low, as if she, too, felt watched by something that remembered and expected. "I did," Jon answered. "I needed you to hear it first." Sansa studied him. The last weeks had honed her composure into something steadier than the girl he'd known in Winterfell's kitchen doorways. She who had once counted songs instead of secrets. There was steel along her cheekbones now and an old sadness in her eyes, like stones left behind by a retreating tide. She would not show fear to him. That was a cold comfort and a costly one. "Is it about the Glenmores? Or Glover?" she asked. "If it is men you want, there are no more men in the north. Not for us." "It isn't that." He looked down at his hands. They were broad, capable, remembered training yards and ice on a sword hilt and the warmth of horses' necks. They had held Longclaw and a girl's small, cooling fingers as she died in a cave of light. A man came to the camp. "Who?" Tormund said he moved like a heron looking for a fish under snow. "Small folk call them crannogmen. He knew my father. He was with him when the rebellion ended." Sansa drew closer. Wind combed through the treetops and the carved face seemed to glisten, as if a tear had formed beneath the red lid. What did he want? To repay a debt, to fulfill a promise. Jon drew a small thing from his vest, pinned against his skin as if for warmth. It was a ribbon of coarse cloth, stained and frayed, but the thread still gleamed faintly where a sigil had once been stitched. 3 heads curved into a spiral faded like a memory seen through frost. "He said my mother gave this to my father when I was born. He said my father gave it to him when he left a tower in the south with a newborn in his arms." Sansa's mouth opened and then closed. Color ebbed from her lips, and he realized that for all her steel, she remained starkly vulnerable to words that changed the shape of her past. "Your mother. She was not the woman they named," Jon said. He said it softly, like something that shattered if spoken too loud. "He says she was Lyanna." Sansa's gloved hand gripped the strap of her cloak until the leather creaked. Her eyes went distant, turned inward toward the shape of a girl laughing in a courtyard, twirling with a crown of winter roses until the petals scattered like blue snow. Sansa had never seen Lyanna, but Ned Stark's children had been raised amidst her absence like an altar. They had breathed their father's silence as if it were incense. "Lyanna?" she repeated, and the syllables trembled like a suddenly plucked string. "He was with my father at the end. He swore by the old gods to keep her secret. He swore because she had made our father promise." Jon looked up at the face cut in the white wood. The mouth was downturned in sorrow, the eyes the same long slits of a wolf's. "He said my name was not Jon. He said it was Aegon." Sansa stared as if the snow itself had found a voice and it had spoken blasphemy. "Aegon, Targaryen?" The last word left her raw. Rhaegar's blood. Lyanna's. My father, our father, kept me safe with a lie. Not simply because I was born a bastard, but because I wasn't one and would have died for it. Sansa drew one unsteady breath, then another, as if she had run through the length of Winterfell. Her eyes shone with something that was not joy but not grief either. It was the strangest relief, a horror that explained the ache it replaced. Rhaegar, the man who took her. He says Rhaegar loved her. He says they were wed by a septon. He says... Jon stopped. Words failed in the same place they always failed, where love and war tangled and men bled while stories made fossils of their bones. Sansa, I don't know what to make of a dead man's love, but Howland Reed is no braggart. He has no cause to lie. If any man alive stands as witness, it is he. He could be mistaken. He brought more than this cloth. Jon reached into his jerkin and unfolded a parchment stiff with age, sealed in a broken wax he did not know. Written across it in a hand that was not his father's were lines of a testament and a signature of a septon whose name was recorded among the Southron priests of Dorne. Jon could not read the flowery flourishes as well as Sansa, taught by Septa Mordain, but he could trace the shape of the truth in ink. It says a marriage was made. It names Rhaegar and Lyanna. It is witnessed by knights who died beneath a tower of joy that became a tomb. The wind moved through the gods' wood like a low sigh. Sansa touched the parchment, then drew her hand back as if it bit. If this is truth, it is dangerous. And if it is not truth, it is treason to speak it. It is both, Jon said. But lies are dangerous too. Every day I carry the wrong name, I make a mockery of the men and women who die for me. I could keep hiding until the world ends. I could wear the snow like another cloak. But we fight tomorrow, Sansa. We ask men to stand in a field and be cut down. They should know who it is they die for. Sansa watched him for a long while. Her lashes were thick with damp. When she finally spoke, her voice was winter hard. And what am I if you are Aegon? You are Stark, Jon said, and the answer rose like instinct and oath. You are Winterfell. No name I take changes what you are or what I owe this place. If I am Aegon, it is with a wolf's blood in my veins and the gods of my father watching. I will not be a dragon to burn the north. I will not be the south come north with fire. If I name myself, it will be to swear that Winterfell remains Stark, and I fight for the living, not for thrones. Sansa closed her eyes. When they opened again, the steel had not softened, but it had deepened, more like something folded and tempered than merely set. I won't pretend I don't fear it. The North remembers the Mad King in a way a child remembers hot iron. Rhaegar's song may be different in the South, but there is still dragon breath in it. Falcons and flayed men will whisper what they want whispered, that a Targaryen comes to claim a wolf's castle. I won't claim it, Jon said. I will hold it, for you, for our people, if the gods win us the field. Sansa looked to the flayed black shape of Winterfell in the distance. Then tell them, but tell them yourself. Not in a raven's hand, not from a reedman's mouth. Look into their faces and claim the danger, or they will make it up themselves in their tents. Jon's throat eased with the gratitude that came when someone insisted you do the hard thing you had already decided upon. He nodded. One more thing, Sansa added, her voice low. If you choose this, do not flinch when they test you for it. The first man who calls you liar in front of your banners will not do it because he holds truth in his hands. He will do it to learn if the dragon has a spine of bone or milk. Show them the bone. Then show them mercy if they have the sense to bow. Jon rose, clapped his hand to Ghost's neck, and the dire wolf leaned his weight against his leg, warm and silent as a hearth. Will you stand with me? I will stand with you, she said, and a small, sad smile ghosted her mouth. Brother, he could not help the brief huff of laughter. Sister, he answered. He let the word settle, old and new at once. When the council was called at dusk, the sky had gone the color of iron and the snow had thickened into something that muffled even shouts. The largest tent was crowded with the rough fur and leather smell of wildlings, the salt sour of unfurled fish banners, the faint HWSS of oil in lamps. Davos stood near the entry flap like a dark, watchful post. Tormund had claimed a stave at the center and used it to gesture, to scratch lines in the frost on the table that was serving as a battlefield. Lyanna Mormont sat, too short for the chair, her small hands folded upon a table she controlled by sheer presence. Wyman Manderley had sent men and 2 sons with a fat man's sense of when to be cautious, and they crowded near Lord Serwyn's men, faces hidden under their hoods, eyes sharp within. The storm of banners made the air feel like a forest of cloth and shadow. The bear, the trout, the merman green and white, the flayed man turned right side up out of spite alone. Around them murmured lesser knights and hedge lords and men whose hands had known more plowshare than spear until the world called them otherwise. Davos's gaze found Jon's as he entered and one eyebrow lifted. "Are you ready?" It was a plain, good question like everything Davos asked. Jon answered with a short nod. Melisandre had not been asked to this council. She waited beyond the tense light, as if the snow were a baptism she meant to complete. Jon did not climb to the head of the table. He stood in a space where all could see him, with Sansa at his right hand, close enough that he could feel her presence but not so close that she'd seem his echo. Ghost lay behind them like drifted snow that had remembered how to breathe. "We meet as we have met every night," Jon began. His voice carried in the pocketed air. "To speak of lines and fodder, of swords that have more notch than edge, of the number of arrows we have and the number we wish we had. We are outmatched in horses. We are outmatched in mail. But there are more things than iron in a fight." Tormund's mouth quirked. "Aye, teeth. One's fist. My charm." A ripple of laughter unbidden by fear moved through the tent, and Jon did not fight it. He welcomed the pulse of life. He let silence reclaim them, then continued. "There is something more. You have followed me from the wall to the woods of the Umbers. Some of you call me the Lord Commander, and some of you call me your lord, and some of you call me the fool who brought free folk south. Many of you call me bastard. I want the last of those words put to rest tonight. I want the truth spoken where all can hear." Lord Glover, stiff as a frozen fence post, folded his arms. "Truth is we need more men than we will ever have and more good fortune than the gods give to men who follow bastards." Lyanna Mormont's small chin lifted. She flashed him a glance that could have shamed an army. Jon lifted a hand. "I do not ask for patience with what we know. I ask for patience with what only a few now know. Howland Reed, Lord of Greywater Watch, came into our camp today. He fought beside my father when King Robert sat down and Rhaegar fell upon the trident. He fought beside my father again beneath a lonely tower in the south. He was there when my mother died. He had always tried to imagine her face. He had always failed. He could piece together candles and sweat and a fevered breath. But a woman was more than the shape of a deathbed. He did not try to fill the tent with her phantom. He simply let her name arrive as a simple thing. Her name was Lyanna Stark. The ripple now was not laughter. It was a rearrangement of standing and the quickened breath of men who smelled danger. Manderley's eldest son murmured a prayer to the old gods. Lord Serwyn's man stole a look at Sansa, and she met it serenely, though Jon saw how her hand pressed lightly against the table as if to feel would under an ocean. "Lord Reed swore upon this very tree's brothers," Jon said, tipping his head toward the tense flap and the snow beyond, "that he held vigil while she labored. He held vigil while she named me. He says my father, Ned Stark, took me from her arms with a promise he would die before breaking." "And what name did she give you?" Glover demanded. There was something hungry around his mouth that would be satisfied whether he ate bread or blood. "Aegon." Jon kept his voice the same pitch. The name hung in the air like a torch. "Aegon Targaryen." Someone hissed. A man near the back made the sign against fire as if a priest would do. Tormund grunted, uncertain whether to laugh. One rumbled, audible through canvas, a sound like mountains shifting in their sleep. A scuffle as men turned, as if they could flee the syllables by stepping aside. "You bring dragon names into a northern tent," Glover snarled. "You speak of the blood of the man whose father burned Lord Rickard and strangled Brandon in the south. Have you no shame?" Jon met his gaze. "I have shame. For leaving a watch I swore, and breaking an oath that was all that kept me from becoming the thing they hated me for being. I have shame aplenty, but I will not have shame for the truth. The truth does not ask what it costs us. It is only true. Davos spoke then, his rasp steady. A name's a sack around a man's life. You can carry one sack or two, but the grain's the same. There's grain enough in this lad to feed 10 winters. Manderly's second son cocked his head. If he is a Targaryen, Lord Davos, will he call dragons down upon our fields? If I had a dragon, I would teach it to burn dead things beyond the wall. Jon answered before Davos could. I would teach it to burn nothing else. I have this blade. He drew Longclaw, and the steel took the lamplight and threw it back white and cold. It cuts the dead quieter than fire does. Lyanna Mormont stood. A gesture that turned the entire tent toward her by force of curiosity, if nothing else. She looked very small there among bearded men and scars. She looked like a child who had been asked to name the constellations and instead lifted a finger to tell the moon where to stand. You are all fools grown big, she informed them. You complain like old women when the bread's stale and the milk is turned and the air smells of a storm. And then when the storm comes you say you meant to go fetch the sheep from the hill. He is Lyanna Stark's blood. That is what he says. That is what the gods know. If there's dragon in him, it hasn't burned Bear Island yet. The only thing that burned Bear Island was the Ironborn, and I don't see any kraken on his banners, but I do see a direwolf. A low ripple, this one different, an embarrassed amusement threaded with reluctant admiration, moved among the lords. Lyanna Mormont sat again as if she'd done something as simple as slicing bread, and looked bored with the company. Lord Serwyn cleared his throat. The North swore to Winterfell, he said carefully. Always has. If the boy is Lyanna's, then he is not Ned Stark's son, no matter what he was told. Winterfell is Stark. It remains Stark, Jon said. I take no castle from Sansa. If you need a name to call me when I stand tomorrow in a field to keep your sons from falling on the spears of a bastard who flays men, call me Snow. Call me Stark. Call me the fool Davos named me. But understand that I will not hide what I am to make it easier for your tongues. I will not be something smaller so that your fear can fit around me. He paused, not because he had planned it, but because Ghost had come to stand at his side, and the beast's red eyes made points in the dim like a constellation. I am Aegon Targaryen. I am Lyanna Stark's son. I was raised by Eddard Stark. I will hold Winterfell for Sansa Stark if I live through the morrow. And if a man here cannot serve under a name that is half-wolf, then he can leave, because the men who will be our enemies are not counting our syllables. They are counting their arrows. True enough, Manderly's eldest conceded with the quick calculation of a pragmatic mind. Lord Reed, did he swear before the heart tree? Before the gods and before me, Jon said. You may speak to him. He is camped near the ash grove with his men. Glover's mouth flattened. I will speak to him, and if he lies, I will cut my own throat with this blade, Jon said, and the silence that followed had weight. Like a companion they all recognized. I have no interest in living another lie. Glover held his stare a long moment and then looked away first. We ride at dawn, he said, and the anger that had held him like a plank of iron bent, just enough to make him human again. Dragon or wolf, the man we fight is a bastard of worse stripe than any lord's mistake. The council dissolved in a shiver of leather and cold. Tormund slapped Jon's shoulder. Aegon, he tried, testing it like a new ale upon his tongue. Ugly name, I'll stick with Jon. Too many gods down south as it is. Sansa did not speak until the tent had nearly emptied. When she did, it was only one word. Well, Jon agreed. The tremor in his hands had left him only now. He sheathed Longclaw. He breathed. Howland Reed came to him after the candles had guttered halfway. He was a small man, older than he had thought he'd be, with a face like the edge of a quiet lake. Reflective, hard to read, holding more life beneath it than surfaced. He smelled faintly of the bogs and also of crushed herbs, and his tiny frog spear was strapped across his back as if an old habit had refused to loosen. "You did not have to come," Jon said. "I owed your father more than I could pay." Reed answered in a voice that carried the soft accent of the neck, the words touching one another as if they were reeds themselves. "Now I owe you what little witness I still hold. Men are dead for what was done. Better the truth stands in the air than keep drowning with them. Did my mother hold me?" The question was foolish and childish and unavoidable. Howland Reed's mouth softened. "She held you and named you with a fever's clarity. She smelled your hair as if she could braid it into her life. She made me swear by the trees and by the water. She asked that your father give you a name of stone and ice to hide you. He did what he could. He hid the tragedy like a man hides flame in his beard. But flame will out. Was Rhaegar there?" Reed shook his head once, slow. "No. Your father took his sword from a man called Dane. He took his life. He took you. There were no songs in it. Only grief and debt." Jon nodded and exhaled as if he had been braced for a blow that never quite came. "Thank you. You'll thank me if you live." Reed glanced toward the bowed canopy. "There's weather in the air that doesn't belong to snow. Battle weather." Dawn came up a bruise. The world had the color of faded iron until the first thin line of sun found a gap in the cloud and spilled gold on the field ahead of Winterfell, a line like a blade drawn slowly out of a scabbard. Boltons arranged their forces with a precision that belonged to men who had spent their spare moments flaying the world's softness from their hearts. A thin front of archers, cavalry massed behind, footmen with shields drilled into a wall that looked as steady as a stone hillside. Their banners, a man painted inside out against pink, hung perfectly still through the light snowfall. The sight of them made Jon's stomach tighten in disgust like a fist. Jon's forces were a patchwork. The free folk formed the left, restless and fierce, unpretty as storm-broken pines, their axes catching the pale light. The Mormonts and Serwins took the center with such discipline as they could gather. Lord Manderly's men, sturdy and heavy in padded surcoats, held the right. One loomed above them like a hill had learned to walk. Ghost had vanished into the snow, to reappear where needed as if made of it. Davos rode near the center. Tormund paced like a bear walking off cold from his bones. Sansa was not among them. She had left well before dawn with only a few riders and their faces set. Jon had watched her go, after a brief clasp of hands that said nothing and everything. He had not asked because he had learned how to hold faith between his teeth like a bit. He tasted blood now where he had bitten the inside of his cheek. He was grateful for the taste because it proved he lived. They rode out to parley on a little rise still mottled with the old grass of autumn under the dust of snow. Ramsay came with a smirk like a thin slash on fine paper. Small Jon Umber rode at his shoulder. Mutton fat had given the umber a brawny gloss in other seasons. Now he looked carved out of a stump by a dull hatchet, all coarse grain and aggressive knuckles. Jon thought of the great Jon and wondered where laughter went when it left a house. Ramsay took in Jon's banner with an idle tilt of his head. "You've new tales to tell, bastard," he said, voice smooth as oiled leather. "I hear them chirping like little birds in snow." He turned to display the paltry trophies on his saddle. A black piece of cloth, a child's ribbon, a bone charm. "I prefer trophies made of meat." Jon did not let the insult settle. He let it fall like snow along his shoulders and melt. "Tomorrow," he corrected himself. "Today men die. If there's a chance for fewer, take it. Fight me, you and me. Your men watch, ours watch. There's your meat." Ramsay sked quietly. "Oh, but we've proven how a battle by champion turns. Your father's king found a spear in a face by their little game, and the Lannisters took the throne. Champions are for stories. I like my killing done in numbers. It smells better." "You will die," Jon said. "Perhaps. But I don't plan to, and your name won't change my plan. Aegon, Jon Snow. I'll call you dog if it makes you feed my hounds better. They prefer the young, I find. Tender meat, like a boy running." At his signal, men dragged something between them like a net. For a breath, Jon thought it was a deer from the forest, and then the boy's face turned toward him. Pale as milk, eyes too wide. "Rickon," the world briefly lost focus. Everything became the drum of blood and the thin sound a remembered boy had made chasing cats down Winterfell's corridors. Jon had said once that fear cut deeper than swords. This, he learned then, was the edge he had not yet met. Ramsay cut Rickon free and patted his dark hair with a mockery gentle enough to curdle air. "Run to your brother," he said. "Run." He smirked at Jon, and then he nodded at a man with a bow. The arrow arced in the pale air like a careless thought. Jon's horse moved under him without his telling it to. Longclaw burned cold in his hand. He had told himself he would not do this thing. Not again, not the charge that turned a line into a mess, the one-man rush that made men behind him forget their own thought. He had told himself this was the day he would be Aegon as much as Jon, and hold the weight of a name like a commander wore his mail. He had told himself, and the world had answered with a boy's panicked feet flinging prints across snow. Jon spurred. He did not shout. It was the silence of a man falling through a dream he could not wake from. Hoofs pounded. The first arrow fell short. The second skated past Rickon's sleeve. The third lifted a lock of hair and left it drifting like black smoke. Rickon ran the way a child runs in a field full of daisies. The shortest lines were a game, and the straightest path belonged to men who'd studied roads. Jon leaned low and reached, not the blade but his hand, as if it might remake the last 5 years by touch. The sound the arrow made when it went through the boy was small and obscene. It passed between ribs and out again, and Rickon stumbled and then knelt, surprised, as if he'd found kneeling safer than running. He looked up and he smiled, a ghost of a smile, because he had always smiled when he saw Jon. Then he fell forward and the snow took his face and drew his warmth away so instantly it felt like theft. Jon slid from the saddle and landed on his knees without feeling the fall. His gloves were in the snow and then they were not, and his skin met the cold of his brother's hair and it burned. He gathered Rickon, but there was no way to keep a boy's shape in a body that had decided to leave it behind. Breath came back to him with violence. Sound came back. The thunder of hooves and the growing roar of two armies going to meet one another with the same hunger. He wanted to charge, and he wanted to die, and he wanted to take the world in his hands and break it until it gave Rickon back. He forced himself to lay the boy gently down, and he stood. He stood as if the ground had to be taught to hold him. He placed a hand on Rickon's hair, and he said the only thing he could say, inside his own mouth where the gods might hear, I will remember you before this field." Then he turned, and the first wave of horses was almost upon him. He lifted Longclaw and met them. The first rider aimed for his chest. Jon swept the sword in a clean arc and felt the recoil of steel through bone. A horse abreast of him crashed into another, screaming. An empty stirrup spun like a useless thought. An arrow hissed past his cheek. Another took a wildling behind him in the throat, and he saw the man's eyes widen, as if astonished to find himself dying. The smell of the first blood came up, iron and warmth, and winter took it and made it thin. Men shouted names into the wind as if it mattered, and sometimes it did and sometimes it didn't. Jon moved forward into the chaos that he had helped make and understood that name or no name, this was where he understood himself best. Where Longclaw did what it had been made to do and his body moved through a geometry of necessity. The lines stabilized and then broke, stabilized and broke again like a freezing river. Tormund and the free folk hit the Bolton flank with a cry that belonged to the deep woods, a rough music that unnerved tidy men. Manderly's men braced and advanced in the center with all the stubbornness of stones down a hillside, sliding but never quite dislodged. Yet Ramsay did as he had told them he would. He preferred killing that came in numbers. The arrows fell in dark waves, and every man who raised his shield hunkered behind it and slowed, and every man who raised his head to see where he was going took a shaft in a soft place. Their horses screamed, reared, fell. Footmen tripped over corpses and became them. Bolton's spears came forward and flattened like porcupines, then withdrew to let the archers work again, measured, merciless. Jon found himself at the front of a knot of men who refused to dissolve, and he learned in the press how to breathe when there was no air. Bolton's shieldmen had trained under flayed banners until they believed themselves more wall than flesh. Jon and his knot of wildlings and Northmen closed with them, smashed once, twice. One crashed into their right like an avalanche, and the wall shuddered and then reformed, because Ramsay had drilled them in that as well. Become again what you were before the blow landed. They were penned before he recognized the pen. The circle of shields had formed without him noting it, and suddenly the dead around them, friend and enemy, had become a grotesque rampart. The living made the corral and the dead paved it, and inside the crushed men learned new ways to die. Smothered, trampled, crushed under the weight of men they had never met. Someone near Jon screamed and did not stop. Someone else sobbed as if his mother had struck him. Jon's mouth filled with a copper taste as his teeth cut his lip. He could not lift his sword fully without jamming it into a neighbor's shoulder. He thought the old story. This is how men panic, this is how they break, and he fought to keep his breath slow, his vision clear as if clarity could make space. A body slammed into him from behind and weight pressed him forward. He felt the ground go out from under his right foot and then felt ribs like bars against his chest. A man's helmet edge dug into his jaw. He couldn't inhale enough. The sky, the small triangle of sky above the hedge of shields, turned narrower, grayer. He thought he heard Davos yelling, and then the sound of men trying to obey a command they could not. Men clawed at men to find air. A pair of hands, unknown, shoved against his chest in blind panic, and Jon's heel found the back of a corpse and he pushed with it, emerged a half-hand taller into a bubble of breath and daylight. He gulped air like water. Somewhere outside the ring Ramsay's archers kept plying, cold and steady. Somewhere beyond the crush of shield and spear, Tormund bellowed, and the words he used were not words Jon knew, but he understood them anyway. Fury, defiance, a promise that even if he died he would bite. Jon saw the first horse crest the ridge and thought, absurdly, that more Boltons had come. But the pennon that lifted and snapped black against gray was a falcon, and behind it came ranks of men in bright steel, not the piecemeal gear of half-starved northern levies, but the clean, fattened strength of the Vale. For a heartbeat no one believed what they saw. Then a voice rose from behind Jon, Sansa's voice, and every part of him turned toward it at once. Now! She cried, and though she stood far back upon the rise, the men near her surged forward, and the line of falcons came like a tide under a stern wind. Peter Baelish cantered by her shoulder with a cat smile that made Jon think of doors with no hinges. Jon Royce led the charge, iron moving with experience and disdain for the innards of lesser men. The Vale's wedge hit the Bolton's circling wall and punched a hole clean through. The press inside slackened enough that Jon could use Longclaw again, and he did, not with grace but with a relief so sharp it might have been joy. The field tilted. Bolton men, drilled or not, broken by a hammer blow from a fresh column they hadn't counted on, began to fold. The circling shields stuttered, turned ragged. One lifted 3 men at once and flung them, and the sight of men that size flying made something like despair show on faces across from Jon. The free folk found the open spaces and poured through them like melted snow into a crack. The Manderleys advanced with flat-footed certainty, tasting victory with a greedy carefulness. Ramsay, who had never loved anything he couldn't cut, turned his horse and fled for the gate of Winterfell. Jon saw him go, and the world narrowed to a wormhole of purpose. He shouted for Tormund. There was no space for signals beyond that, and took his wedge forward, cutting through pockets of resistance like an axe through sodden wood. Vale men had already seized the momentum. They roared past with a professionalism that raised his hackles and steadied his heart in the same breath. Sansa stood on the ridge and watched like a queen from a wall, and if Peter spoke to her, Jon couldn't see it over the chaos. He spurred toward the gate. Winterfell's gatehouse had a look of aggravation about it, as if a mouth used to swallowing had found a bone too large. It had been closed in Ramsay's face faster than he had expected. The men on the wall shouted at one another in panic as their lord hammered his fist upon their own timbers and demanded entry with a jailer's entitlement. Vale archers took the wall and turned the heated oil that had been prepared against them into a hesitation in the hands of men suddenly unsure of sides. Jon and his knot reached the outer ramparts as the gate began to groan open for the wrong master. "Close it!" someone screamed. "Close!" And one, with a sound like a mountain arguing with its own weight, thrust his fingers into the gap and pulled. The timbers shrieked. Iron fastenings howled as they tore. The great gate that had seen centuries of snow and war opened with an ache Jon felt in his own shoulder. Crossbow bolts thudded into the giant's chest and face, quivering in meat thicker than smaller men's thighs. One took it and kept going, hair rimed with frost, eyes like deep lake water that had caught a pit of sunlight and refused to drown it. The gate surrendered with a final, splintering grunt, and men with wolf standards poured through their own walls. Within the yard, the fight became intimate. You saw the eyes of the man you killed. You felt the warmth of him on your cheek. Ramsay loosed a quiver's worth of arrows in quick succession, and two of them found one, who sank to one knee, then another, then placed a hand on the flagstones as if to reassure himself they still existed. Jon reached him as the giant exhaled. One looked at him, and there was no word. One reached out and patted Jon, clumsy, as if he believed there was a child there he might comfort. Then his hand fell and did not rise, and the yard felt smaller for it, as if the world had lost a story it meant to hear again. Ramsay turned his bow to Jon and loosed. The arrow tapped Longclaw's steel and skittered. Another thudded into Jon's pauldron, a sudden, blunt pain. Jon advanced, rage cooling in him to something that made him a better fighter than fresh fury ever had. He entered the circle of Ramsay's reach, and the Bolton bastard lifted his bow like a cudgel. Idiotic. Jon batted it aside with contempt and struck once, twice, 3 times with his fist. White stars went popping behind his eyes. He tasted his own blood and then Ramsay's, and might have gone on hitting until his knuckles cracked had Sansa's face not appeared in the edge of his vision. Not frightened, not pleading, simply there, like a lighthouse in a storm. He stopped. "Bind him," Jon commanded. "Leave him breathing." They did. The men in the yard, whose sons and brothers and fathers had gone into the snow because of this man's whims, found in themselves the discipline they had not been sure they possessed. Ramsay, lips broken, nose askew, smiled through blood as if he still had a secret treat to dispense. Jon felt the urge to put Longclaw through that smile. He sheathed the sword instead. "Winterfell is yours," Peter Baelish said, because he could not keep himself from naming things. "Lady Sansa, Winterfell is ours," Sansa corrected, and she said it without looking at him. Ramsay died not by Jon's hand. Sansa had asked for that, and Jon had given it. In the kennels, the dogs paced restlessly. They smelled the blood of the day and the blood of their master, and they had not been fed. Sansa spoke to them as one might speak to old, violent gods. The men who would have watched, some to savor, some to tally debt, found other tasks, because some kinds of justice you let happen without witnesses. When Sansa returned to the yard, her face was pale and blank and steady. Jon looked at her and did not thank her, because thanks would have been indecent. He touched her arm. She nodded, a small, brittle motion that said she was still present inside herself and would find a way to sleep in that skin. Night closed around Winterfell with the intimacy of an old lover returned from a voyage of years. The fires in the Great Hall had not burned like that since Robb had feasted men he didn't know would become ghosts within a season. The smell of roasting meat was heavy in the rafters, and so many bodies radiated heat that the iron in the hinges warmed. Men drank, not wildly, though some did, but like men who needed the distance between now and tomorrow to be measured in mouthfuls of heat. Lyanna Mormont sat like a small, satisfied general and accepted oaths from men twice her grandfather's age. Someone laughed too loud and then winced, caught under the memory of what laughter had cost them since last they called themselves one army. Howland Reed stood in a corner with a cup he did not drink. His eyes tracked men the way fishermen tracked currents. He watched Jon and inclined his head, the smallest salute a man could offer and mean everything by. Jon did not sit in the high seat. He kept to the floor, moving, letting his hand fall upon shoulders, feeling the weight of bone beneath cloth, the reality of men who had answered his voice regardless of what it called him. Davos joined him, a steady rock in a sea of faces. "You lived?" Davos said, mild, as if he were remarking on weather. "So we did," Jon said, because the pronoun mattered. They both looked toward Sansa. She stood next to the high table, quietly speaking with Lord Serwyn and Wyman Manderly's sons, and then listened as Lyanna Mormont scolded Glover again with the smallest twist of her mouth that might have been a smile. "The girl has a gift for pulling men to a point," Davos observed. "Old Manderly's one of the few who enjoys being scolded. Makes him feel like he's back at his wife's table." Jon's mouth twitched. "Do you think they'll accept it? My name." "They'll accept what you give them, lad," Davos answered. "As long as you keep the meat on the table and the wolves on their side of the gate. Names are as sharp as knives in the first cut. After that, they're handles." Melisandre approached them then, quiet as the ash at the end of a log. Her eyes were grave, as if the flames in them had been banked for the night. She looked at Jon with something more human than she usually allowed herself. "You showed your face to men," she said. "Could have been praise. Could have been a simple statement. The prince that was promised wears many masks." "I am not your prince," Jon said, more exhausted in the denial than angry. "You are not mine." Her voice drifted like sparks. "It isn't me who promised. There will be a night with no dawn. Men will remember this warmth then. Names will weigh less than fire." "Shireen," Davos said, and it was not a question and not her name alone, but the weight of it dropped on the flagstones all the same. His eyes were on Melisandre, and the softness Jon respected had hardened. "We will speak of her. Not tonight, but we will speak." He turned and walked away, the meat of his shoulders set like granite heathed in leather. Melisandre watched him go and accepted the blow without defense. "I know," she murmured. Then she looked at Jon again, at his face that had come back from death without his asking. "Tonight you have other gods." He moved because he could not stay there under her scrutiny. The hall's warmth began to feel like a forge. He slipped out through the side door into the corridor that ran along the inside of the outer wall. The stone held cold even when the hall's fire was a memory in the next room. It breathed frost. Jon's breath smoked. He climbed the worn steps toward the god's wood like a man who had promised him something and had not yet delivered. The god's wood had changed since he knelt under a different tree. It smelled older here, less of the airy snow and more of damp earth remembered. The heart tree was heavier, broader in the trunk, its carved mouth gentler. Snow lay in the crooks of its roots like linen thrown carelessly across giant limbs. He had learned in this place to change boys' dreams into men's duties. Now he stood before the face and did not kneel immediately. He had never liked kneeling. Men knelt to kings, but he had always knelt to this face. And if he were a king, he thought, let it be now to this. He went to his knees. Ghost lay beside him and placed his muzzle on Jon's thigh. For a long time Jon did not speak. Nothing in him was small enough for words. Then he found it, the little thing that had always lived under bigger purposes. "Mother," he said. The sound made him start, as if a stranger had addressed him. He tried again. "Lyanna, I do not know you. I don't know what pictures the men in the south drew of you, or what songs they made. I know the way my father looked when someone spoke your name, as if pain had become a kind of bread he'd learned to eat every day without complaint, and a little of it got stuck in his teeth. I know that I was something he carried like a wound. I know that he kept his promise to you. I don't know if Rhaegar deserves songs, but I know this. If he loved you and you loved him, it ended the same as if he'd stolen you. It ended with you dead and him, and me alive. Wind moved through branches. Snow sifted in small avalanches. The tree watched him with a patience that refused to be anything as simple as mercy. I will not bring dragons to these lands, he said. Even if dragons came, I would not let them touch these trees. If ever I go south, I will go as Ned Stark's son and your son both. I will hold Winterfell for Sansa and her children if she has them. I will be a shield and not a sword turned inward. If the dead come, and they will, and if there is anything in me that lifts fire out of my blood, I will use it against them and against nothing living. I swear it by snow and steel. I swear it by the breath of the beast at my side. Ghost huffed, as if agreeing or merely exhaling patience. Jon reached down and spread his fingers in the direwolf's thick fur. Heat came up into his palm and grounded him more than any god. He rose slower than he wished he had to. The hall would not let him stay away forever, and the decision he felt coming would not wait upon a prayer. He descended to the great hall again and entered in time to hear the roar. It began in one voice, Lyanna Mormont's, and then blossomed through 1,000 throats. It was not the name he had expected. It was a name he had always known. It was his and not his. The king in the north. Lyanna stood upon the table bench like a commander, and her small hand struck the wood. I don't care if he's the son of a dragon. A dragon didn't stand between us and the dead beyond the wall. A dragon didn't pull my men out of a storm on the ice lake. A dragon didn't risk his life to save me and mine when the cold wanted to eat us. This man did. And he did it when you all sat fat by your fires and counted your old grudges like coins. He is my king. Manderley's eldest bowed his big head and put a hand over his heart, as if something had shifted there and needed acknowledging, lest it throw him off balance. There's more wolf in him than dragon, he said thickly. Aegon or Jon, Stark or Targaryen. There's enough in him to be king. The knives that took Robb were southern knives and northern hands. This is a different boy, and he came back from death. I'll take a king who can scowl at the stranger and make him blink. King in the north, Glover shouted then, with a desperate fervor like a confession. King in the north. Jon found himself standing and did not remember deciding to. Faces turned toward him, ruddied by heat and wine and the simple animal glow of victory. He saw Sansa among them, not smiling, not weeping, looking at him with everything she'd learned and everything she was and some quiet, complex thing between them that had no name yet. He lifted a hand. The roar receded, though it did not end. It pressed against the hall's beams, hungry to burst forth again. He did not climb to the dais. He stood where he was because he would not be taller than men by trick of carpentry. I am Aegon Targaryen, he said into the hush, and a taut line twanged invisibly. He let it and then continued. I am Jon Snow. I am the son of Lyanna Stark. I am the man Eddard Stark raised. You can call me king if it steadies your hands. But understand me, I do not want your kneeling if it keeps you from standing when the dead come. I do not want your crowns if they blind you to the wall. I will take your fealty if what you mean by it is that you will fight when I ask you to, and you will accept hard bread when there is no other, and you will forgive your neighbors their old sins when you need their shields and their plows. I will be your king in the north if that means I am your servant in winter. Silence, and then something less noisy but more significant than any cheer. Men straightening. The shape of a hall changing. Davos nodded once, his mouth hard in approval. Lyanna Mormont smiled like a wolf cub. Sansa spoke into that silence then, and every ear bent for her. Then let Winterfell be what it has always been, she said. The hearth where the north warms its hands. The gate that does not open to the flames of the south. The place where our dead rest, and where we watch for what would wake them. My lord, my brother, my king, we will hold it for you until the spring breaks the snow. And if spring does not come, we will hold it anyway. The cheer did come then, wild and grateful and stubborn as the wind that scoured the pieces of ice from riverbanks in a thaw. Jon let it wash over him. He did not feel taller. He did not feel different. He felt tired, and he felt the warmth of lives clinging to one another under a roof, and he felt the weight of a name like a cloak he had chosen for a journey he could not avoid. He felt Ghost lean at his thigh again. He felt Sansa's eyes on him like a steadying hand between his shoulder blades. When the hall finally thinned, when men found pallets and corners and the excuses they needed to wrap themselves in cloaks and silence, Jon and Sansa walked the dark corridor again, their steps ringed by the iron of old torches. Winterfell breathed around them like a beast too old to be anyone's pet. They turned into the crypts with their torches guttering, and each descent felt like a history less and less willing to forgive. They stood before banners and stone wolves and the granite faces of their dead. Lyanna's statue watched them with that familiar mix of stubbornness and mischief carved into lips that could not move now. Snow dusted her shoulders. Jon lifted the torch. The shadow of his own face kissed hers briefly and skittered away. I will have your bones brought up, Sansa said quietly. From that sad southern tomb. I will put you where you belong. With father and with. Her voice veered toward motherhood and pulled away. Here. Jon nodded. He did not trust his voice there. He simply stood, letting the torch warm air around their faces, letting Lyanna's stone eyes teach him nothing and everything. After a time, Sansa spoke again. Do you mean to send word to the south? To whom? To the Dragon Queen, she said, and it was not mockery. It was caution. To the storm that is said to be gathering on the sea. If you are who you say you are, and I do not doubt it now, she may think she has a claim on you. Or you upon her. I have a claim on nothing, Jon said. Not her ships. Not her dragons. I have a claim on the men who died today, and on those who will die tomorrow if we set ourselves to playing thrones while the dead walk. If she comes with fire, we will set it against the night's cold. If she comes with a crown, I will set it on a table and let it sit there until the cold is beaten. I am tired of crowns like traps. Sansa breathed out, as if relieved in a way and disappointed in a way, and both those ways were honest. Littlefinger will suggest 1,000 other answers. Littlefinger will be thanked for the knights he brought and asked to remember that Winterfell is not the Eyrie and I am not Lisa, Jon said, flat as an oath. Sansa smiled at that, a small dangerous promise. Good. Jon lowered the torch. They climbed. The night had thinned. Dawn, which came so late in winter as to feel like an apology, teased the edges of the east with ash blue. The yard lay quiet under a new drift. Men snored in a music of exhaustion. A raven rattled on its perch, agitated by dreams it could not speak. Jon felt the tug in his chest that told him there was no more sleep to be found. Work waited, and it did not smooth its hair when told to. On the wall walk he found Howland Reed again, looking small above Great Stone. The Crannogman turned toward him as if he'd expected him to come. There is a lake in my land, Reed said without greeting, as if resuming a sentence he'd begun in a different life. It is narrow and long. In winter it tries to be a river and fails. In spring it tries to be a swamp and nearly succeeds. It holds 100 kinds of fish and twice as many secrets. You can drown in it without ever seeing your own feet. Kings are like that lake. Jon looked out over the white. So are bastards.
Reeds mout bent.
Your father would be proud. He might be angry, Jon said, surprising himself with the strength of it. He had not allowed that possibility room to breathe. Now it felt good to say it. He kept the secret for a reason. He might call me foolish. He might tell me I'd undone what he did with a word. He might, Reed agreed, and he would still be proud. He loved truth more than he loved cleverness. He loved his sister more than himself. He would understand. He would be angry because you had risked yourself. He would be proud because the thing you risked yourself for was not a throne. Jon nodded once. It felt like being absolved by a man who had no authority and all of it at once. Do you mean to be king? Reed asked, and the question was less direct than it sounded, because Reed did not believe in crowns any more than he believed in dry land that lasted. I mean to be a wall, Jon said, and a door, and a hearth, whatever shape the North needs that keeps men alive. Then you already are, Reed said, and bowed with the gravity of water, accepting a fish back into it. The day uncurled into tasks. Counting losses, counting arrows, counting bread, counting grudges, and gently, carefully, folding them away. Men were buried. Rickon was found where the snow had begun to undo him and brought into the hall of their fathers and laid upon a board wrapped in linen. And Sansa sat beside him for a long time, her hands motionless upon her lap. Jon watched from the doorway, not intruding upon the last business of a sister and a brother. When she rose, he went in, and he laid his hand upon the linen and felt nothing and felt everything. Peter came to him with his cat smile at noon, when the pale light had climbed to its highest and mocked daylight. Your Grace, he said, and Jon almost did not recognize the title as aimed at him until he saw the small amusement in the man's eyes, the way he had thrown the word like a knife and was watching to see if it stuck. The veil is at your service. I thank you, Jon said, and let gratitude be what it was, simple and unbartered. Your men turned the tide. That is what tides do, Peter said. They turn. sometimes at the sound of a woman's voice. Jon held his gaze. Your men have their food? They have more than they had in their saddlebags. Good. The storm will keep us all here longer than we like. Peter's gaze slid toward Sansa, who was walking with Lyanna Mormont. 2 wolves at different sizes, and back again. Winterfell has room for the friends it needs. It does, Jon said. And for the friends it will have tomorrow. Thank you for being here today. Peter's mouth moved as if he had bitten into something that was not what he expected. He gave a little half bow and drifted away, and Jon watched him go like a man who knew the kind of snow that looked pretty until it collapsed a roof. That night, alone in the chamber that had been prepared for him and that had held stark bones and stark dreams for so many unbroken years, Jon stood before a hearth and watched the fire eat wood and give heat back. Ghost lay on the rushes, and the sound of his breathing tethered the room. He unfastened his cloak and let it drop onto a chair, shed his cuirass like a second skin, rubbed at the bruises that began to speak beneath his shirt. He closed his eyes and returned to the moment on the field when Rickon had turned his face toward him and smiled. He thought of names then, all of them obsolete in the face of a boy he had failed to reach. There was a soft knock at his door. He did not say come. He went and opened, because he could not bear to call permission to anyone in that house like a lord who had learned to love the sound of his own leave. Sansa stood there, hair unbound, a shawl around her shoulders. She entered on the tide of his nod and moved to the hearth without speaking. They stood together a time in silence warm enough to make their faces prickle. I want you to know, she said finally, looking into the flames, that I heard the men. All the things they said about dragons, about kings. I heard them and I weighed them, and I am still not ashamed of you. He opened his mouth and found humility had seized his throat like a hand. He swallowed it and tried again. Then I can bear the rest, I think. They will test you, she said. They will test me. They will test Winterfell because it has had too many masters in too few years, and they believe they can handle it like a calf that has decided to live. We will not let them. We will not, he agreed. She looked at him then, and her eyes were not a girl's anymore, and not a woman's who had been given choice. They were a woman's who had built a choice out of lesser tools and dared to use it. I am glad, she said simply, that you are who you are. It makes the world make more sense, even if it makes it harder. He breathed out. It does. She smiled, small and genuine, and turning. Good night, Aegon. It was the first time she had tried it aloud like that, and it did not clang. It settled. Good night, Sansa. He watched her go. He shut the door. Later, when sleep finally came, it came in pieces. He dreamed of a tower open to the sky and the cry of the wind through stones. He dreamed of a woman whose hair smelled like rain on cold stone, who placed a small bundle in his father's arms and said a name with such fierce tenderness that the name became a promise, not a claim. He dreamed of the wall and of a night with no dawn behind it, where shapes moved through a snow that swallowed sound, and his sword made a white sing as it cut. He dreamed of a dragon's shadow passing over fields of ice, and the shadow was not frightening so much as it was immense. He woke with the knowledge that the greatest storms were still ahead, and that the best things men could do when they knew it was to stack their firewood carefully and be honest with one another about the cold. Snow fell in the morning again, because that is what snow does in winter. They began to bring the dead to the yard. They began to mend the walls. They began to count grain carefully. Eyes narrowed the way one narrows them when counting a child's fingers. Ravens were sent. To the Manderleys in White Harbor, to Deepwood Motte, to the scattered bones of the Hornwoods and the Glover's cousins, and to the Marsh kings who weren't kings anymore. One raven flew farther and did not say to whom it was sent. Its message had no name at the top, because names would have gotten in the way. It said only, "We have held Winterfell. The dead are coming. Bring fire." It flew south and then east, and if dragons existed it would find them by the heat they made. Under the heart tree Sansa buried the ribbon that had once been a sigil unstitched by time. She pressed it into the dirt near the roots and covered it over with handfuls of old leaves. And she thought of a girl laughing with flowers in her hair, and then screaming, and then whispering, and then gone. She thought of her own daughter, unborn, unnamed, and she hoped that if she ever laughed, it would be in a world where laughter did not come at the expense of something they could not afford to lose. Jon watched her and did not speak, because sometimes the most loving thing one could do in the face of grief was to leave space for it like a chair at a table. He closed his eyes and offered his silence to the gods who lived in red wood and wind, and he felt, just for a heartbeat, as if something old and glad had approved a small part of the day. Winter was not finished. The dead did not negotiate. The south flickered with wars like fires left unattended. But in the north a man had said his name at last, and the echo of it had found the right walls to settle in. The men who had heard it would go out into snow with it in their ears like a drumbeat, and when the night pressed close, they would remember the warmth of the hall and the steadiness of a sister's gaze and the way a direwolf's breath puffed in a cold room. They would be brought back by these things. Names mattered or they didn't, and the only test worth making was the one that came when the first of the dead stepped into spear reach and the living held their ground together. Jon stood at Winterfell's walls and watched the pale east, and he felt no crown on his head. He felt the weight of a sword and the warmth of a cloak and the presence of a house that had endured more winters than any living man could count. He felt his father's hand on his shoulder as it had been when he was a boy, heavy, kind. He felt his mother's whisper in a language beyond words. He felt the world turn, slow and terrible and beautiful. He breathed in cold air that bit his lungs, and he smiled despite it, because they had won a day and winter gives men few enough of those to waste. He turned and went down into the yard where men waited to be told what to do next. And he told them, and they did it, and Winterfell held. At dawn the yard lay in the blue hush that comes before men begin to speak. The snow had stopped for the moment, and the sky wore a thin wash of color like an old bruise healing. Davos waited beside the well, his hands empty, as if he didn't trust himself with anything that could be thrown. The toy stag he'd once kept tucked in his glove was in his palm now, the little bit of carved bone made smooth by a dead girl's fingers. Melisandre crossed the yard without hurry, the red of her robes subdued in the cold, steam breathing off the cloth with each step as if the garment itself were a hearth. She looked at the stag, then at Davos, and lowered her eyes without pretending not to know what he would say. "Where?" Davos asked. The words seemed to frost in the air and fall in shards. "In a camp south of here," she answered, voice soft, almost a whisper that wanted to be kind and dared not. "On a night when the snow walked into the tents and lay down beside the children. You burned her," he said, and the calm of his tone frightened Jon when he came upon them, as if all the rage had frozen and waited to crack the first man who touched it. "You took a girl with a hunger for stories and you put a rope around her life and handed one end to the fur. You told yourself a god wanted it, but the god didn't cry. I did." Melisandre's mouth softened under the weight of her own failure, and for once she did not look past men toward flames only she could see. "I saw a road and believed it led to dawn. You killed our dawn," Davos said. Jon stepped close and the yard's breath held. He had put on a cloak, but his hair still dampened at the temples. Sleep had not taken him far from the wall he'd leaned against in the night, but it had taken him far enough to bring him clarity. "I can't hang you," he told Melisandre. "If I do, I make you a martyr for a fire that doesn't warm men like Davos. But I can't keep you. You will ride south and you will not return to the north. If you do, I will have your head, and I will not ask Davos to watch." Melisandre bowed her head as if the sentence were a prayer. "I will go," she said. "We will meet again when winter has put its hands around our throats. I have seen that much." "Perhaps," Jon said, and turned away before the yard could think he had let prophecy stand beside law. Davos watched her go with the square-set jaw of a man who had expected no better and had hoped for worse. When she reached the gate, her red faded into the white like an ember carried too far into snow. "Thank you," Davos said to Jon without turning his head, "for what you could do." "It's not enough," Jon said. "It never is," Davos answered, and tucked the little stag back inside his glove like a bone under skin. By noon the hall had filled again, not with the heated clamor of victory, but with the measured murmur of a people doing the arithmetic of survival. Jon took the high seat only because Sansa had pressed her hand to the carved arm of it first, and left hers there until he sat. Lyanna Mormont perched like a hawk on the bench to the side and watched men fidget with their honor. Lord Glover, chastened by a child's contempt and by his own conscience, sat with shoulders rounded as if a weight had chosen him and he had not learned yet how to carry it. House Karstark and House Umber stood with Ramsay Bolton, Lord Serwyn stated, voice careful, expecting the air to shift. It did. Men's eyes flicked like minnows. Their treason should not be washed away in the same water as our sweat. Sansa's glance slid to Jon and then outward to the hall. The men who led them to it are dead. Lords die and houses live, Glover argued, finding a spine because he'd already bent it. If treachery breeds like wheat, you don't harvest the same field next year and expect bread that doesn't taste of rot. Bring them, Jon said, and Maester Wolkan, pale and careful as always, nodded to a man at the door. They filed in like children called to answer for a broken plate. Alice Karstark's cheeks had a stubborn flush, as if she'd pinched them to keep from looking afraid. Beside her walked Ned Umber, a boy with eyes too round and hands that couldn't keep still. Snow had clung to their cloaks and melted just enough to darken the wool. When they stopped before the high table, water tapped off the hems like a clock. "My father died at the last hearth," Alice said without prompting, chin lifting as if she could meet the hall's gaze with bone alone. "He chose wrongly. I did not choose. My uncle died here," Ned Umber blurted, then swallowed, then said more carefully, "At your gate. He chose wrongly too. I can speak for boys with poor uncles if you like, because I seem to be one." Lyanna Mormont's mouth twitched. Lord Serwyn glared down at his own hands as if betrayed by their lack of instruction. The murmurs rose, then settled. Jon stood. The hall quieted as if his body had absorbed their voices. "Your fathers betrayed the North," he said. "They turned their banners for the wrong man and they put their spears into our bellies. Blood pays for such debts. Their blood has paid. If we strip the names from your houses because your fathers' winters were longer than their wits, we teach the North to devour its children to punish its dead. I will not do it. You have your names. Keep your oaths." Silence held for a heartbeat as men decided whether their pride could stand to be led toward mercy. Sansa watched their faces and saw the calculation there. Grudges weighing themselves against grain, honor against hunger. Then she leaned forward, and her voice, when it came, was steady as a board laid across a broken floor. "The houses of the North are old," she said. "Older than any southern crown. Older than any dragon. They have weathered lords who drank too much and heirs who could not close their fists around a sword hilt without crying, and winters that took half their children in a month. You do not keep such houses standing by knocking out their stones when a storm hits. You brace them, you tar their roofs. You teach their boys and girls to keep a ledger that includes their neighbors' needs. I say return their names and take their oaths with us watching." Lyanna Mormont slapped the table with delight as if someone had told a joke only she could hear. "There. Sense. I wondered where you'd been keeping it." Lord Serwyn exhaled, nodding because someone else had put words to a thing he could approach only sideways. Glover looked sour and moved his mouth around an objection that died unspoken. Jon stepped down from the dais. He did not call Alice and Ned to him like a lord asking for formal words. He went to them and held out his hand like a man greeting the children of a neighbor he meant to visit again and again for the rest of his life. "Your oath," he said. "Not to me, to the North, to Winterfell, to each other." They knelt together without looking at one another, and their voices were trembling but clear. When they rose, the hall felt a fraction warmer. Grudges found new shelves to rest on. The days arranged themselves like stones in a wall. Men went out with shovels and came back with shovels, and the ground a little tidier about the dead. The gods would saw a slow parade of those who had never prayed and those who always had, and it suffered both with the gentleness of old bark. Letters came and went like ravens pretending to be snow. Wyman Manderly's hand was fat and round. The words inside were exact. Deepwood Mott promised timber. Widows promised sons. Boys promised courage with an eagerness that frightened their uncles. Jon slept in a bed that had been a boy's once, and then a man's, and then a lord's, and now a king's, and it felt like all of those things and none of them. Howland Reed left with the quiet of water slipping from a shore. He stood in the godswood and pressed 2 fingers to the heart tree as if it were a friend's wrist he was feeling for an old pulse, and then he bowed to Sansa and to Jon. "When the ice speaks," he said, "it does not say your name, says the name of the next cold thing. Remember that." Jon embraced him. He smelled mud and leaf and the specific green of the neck that never dried no matter how long it was pressed between pages. "Thank you."
I ovedned stark, Reed sighed.
"And Lyanna, now I owe you a debt I cannot name." He smiled like a man who knew too many secrets to tell one more, and faded into his men, and then into the weather. The knock at Winterfell's gate came 3 days later with a rhythm like a remembered song. Cautious, insistent, wrong for raiders. Jon stood on the wall and looked down into a face he had loved always without having met it. Bran's eyes were the wrong age. Mira Reed stood beside his sledge with the look of a girl who had dragged winter behind her by its hair and would set it down only when told to buy a god. They brought Bran to the heart tree. He did not look around the gods wood like a boy seeing an old toy. He looked at it like a man reading a familiar book in a language that had taught him too much. Sansa held his hand a moment too long and then let it go as if the letting were a wound that might close if exposed to air. Jon knelt before him because something old in him insisted and because Bran was seated and it felt wrong to stand above him. Ghost came and lay at Bran's feet without being called, and the boy's hand moved in the thick white fur and rested there as if it had found a home it had needed. "You know," Bran said. "I know," Jon answered, and the word meant every hard-won thing and also the particular one. "She loved him," Bran said, eyes unfocusing in a way that stiffened Sansa's spine. "Our aunt. She loved Rhaegar, not in a song, in a room where she could hear her own breath and the wind beyond the stones. He was not Ares. He sang to her before he ever touched her. And then he left her because duty and fathers and war told him where to stand, and she bled and died with your name in her mouth." Jon's hands had learned how to hold a sword. They had not learned how to hold sentences like that, and they shook. "Can you show me?" Bran's gaze slipped past him and then came back the way a hawk returns to a glove. "I can show you that it happened. I can't give you the weight of the air or the smell of her hair. I could give you the shape of the room, the sound of birds. You would think it was a story. You would be wrong and you would still think it. I will take what you can give," Jon said. Bran put a hand to the heart tree's smooth white shoulder and closed his eyes. The wind passed through the leaves with a sound like silk being worried by careful fingers. Jon's breath slowed to match it. Sansa's hand found Jon's forearm and did not leave it. Images rose and fell in Jon like tides he'd only ever watched from shore. A narrow bed under a pale ceiling, a basin with blood circling the water in threads like red smoke, a boy's cries, a girl's soft, fierce voice, hands so small and strong they could have been leaves and the wind together. He did not see a face, not fully, never fully, but he felt the shape of it in absence, like a door he could not open and did not need to. When the tree let them go, the snow felt new. Jon pressed his forehead to the bark, and the wood was cold and damp, and he loved it for being exactly itself. Sansa's grip tightened and he let it. "Now you owe them nothing but the truth," Bran said. There was no judgment in it. There was not even a gentleness. There was only the certainty of a winter that did not apologize for arriving. "Stay," Jon said to Mira, when she came to him that afternoon by the stables to ask for a horse and to say that the marsh called her. "We have need of the reeds." "You have Bran," she answered, with a tired smile that looked like a scar. "And you have his truth. The marsh needs me more than Winterfell does, and I want a bed that doesn't move with the wind, and a roof that doesn't drip memories, and a man who will laugh at the worst jokes I know." She touched Jon's arm. "Keep him warm. He forgets to add wood to the fire when he goes walking." "I will," Jon promised. Mira kissed Bran's brow and left with all the same quiet her father had carried, and the snow closed behind her like a curtain. Word of Bran's return spread faster than ravens and slower than desire. Men came to look upon him as if the boy had become a relic. He took it with the same mildness he took everything now, though sometimes at night Sansa heard him whisper names that had no place in Winterfell, cold names, old names, syllables like cracked ice and distant lightning. She sat with him in the mornings, and he spoke to her of the courtyard when they were small, of the time Arya had driven a needle into Sansa's doll and laughed until Sansa cried, of the way Robb had thrown snowballs too hard and then cried when he saw the welt. Then he would grow still, and he would say something like, "The Night King does not laugh," in a tone that made the day feel thinner. Sansa listened and learned that grief could become a map if you let it. Arya did not come with Bran. She arrived with winter's teeth tucked under her tongue and fry blood dried under her nails days later, slipping through the side gate with a hood too big for her sharp face. 2 guards tried to turn her away and found themselves relieved of their dignity and their spears. Later they swore she had become a shadow and moved through the iron lattice like smoke. She joined Sansa in the great hall without ceremony, and for a long heartbeat they said nothing, and then they were girls again and were not, because girls came back from the road different and sisterhood had to learn their new measurements. "You look like father when you lie," Arya said finally, which was a strange kind of blessing. "You look like mother when you tell the truth," Sansa answered, and Arya's smile fractured and shone. At night, Arya and Brienne danced with wooden swords in the yard. Men watched because they could not help themselves. It was not pretty, and it was beautiful. Arya moved like a thought given legs. Brienne moved like certainty figuring out how to walk in a world that hated it. The sound their sticks made woke the hall's old beams. Sansa watched and learned things she had not known about her sister's body. Littlefinger watched too, eyes half-lidded, enjoying a plan even when it came apart in his hands. He moved through Winterfell's corridors like a ghost who believed he still had rooms to haunt. He spoke with Glover and with Serwyn and with Manderly's sons. He weighed their grumbles and tasted their fears and began to set stones upon them. He spoke to Sansa in the God's Wood beneath a face too patient for his charms. "You have brought the North together," he said, smiling with half his face and leaving the other half free to do sums. "You can keep it together if you take what is offered." His hand made a small circle, drawing Vale and North into the same ring. "A wedding that puts a lock on the Ares gate and your gate both." Sansa looked at him the way a woman looks at the weather when deciding whether to bring in the wash. "You mean a wedding that puts a collar on my neck and a chain through my throat to your fist?" "I mean security," Peter purred. "A collar is only a chain if you don't know how to use the leash." "And you would teach me?" Her smile was thin as ice over a well. "I would," he said, "but you learn quickly. Perhaps you could teach me how to let the North be ruled by a dragon without a fire in its belly. Perhaps I could teach you how to hold your tongue and keep your head," she said. "Lessons have a way of repeating themselves in this house." He bowed because he knew no other way to keep his face when a woman did not give him hers. He began to weave other strands, Arya's knife, Sansa's patience, Bran's distance, into a net that would not hold fish, and disastrously believed he could pull it tight around wolves. The raven from the south came with Tyrion's precise hand. The parchment smelled faintly of lemon and salt as if the sea had breathed on it. Jon turned it over in his fingers and read it twice and then handed it to Davos. "Jon Snow," it began then, "Aegon Targaryen, if the wind in the north carries true. You once told me all dwarfs are bastards in their father's eyes. I have learned since that some bastards are princes in their mothers. I serve a queen who asks no man where he was born before she asks what he will do. She sits now at Dragonstone, where there is said to be dragonglass like black winter under the ground. The dead will not be persuaded by speeches, but they can be cut. Come and speak with Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, first of her name. Come and take what you need to fight your war. Bring only the men you must. The world has too few already." Davos snorted softly at the last line, as if pleased by a wit he had not expected to meet again. "I liked him," he admitted. "In a way, a man likes a boy who stabs a wasp nest because he's curious how the world stings." Jon looked to Sansa. "I must go." "You must," she said, without pretending she liked it. "The dragonglass belongs under our feet, shaping our knives, not under hers shaping her dreams." "The lords will not like it," Jon said. "The lords will have to learn to live with things they don't like," Sansa answered. "It's winter." The hall answered predictably. Glover spoke of kneeling as if it were a sickness of the south. Manderley wondered if the Dragon Queen would want back the heads her ancestor took from his line. Lyanna Mormont rolled her eyes with such ferocity that the armored men near her seemed to flinch. Jon let them and then raised his hand. "I will go," he said, "and Sansa will rule in my stead. The North is not a flock of children that howls when a parent leaves the room. It is a house. Houses stand when men go to fetch what the house needs. I will go get fire. I will bring it back." Sansa stepped forward before the murmurs could decide what shape to take. "You will bring back men too, if men are to be bought by the truth. The truth is that winter does not care for crowns. If Daenerys Targaryen comes north with dragons to fight the dead, she will be honored at our table. If she comes with chains, the dragons will starve." Jon and Davos left 2 days later with a handful of men who had learned by now how to travel without making noise on frost. They rode to White Harbor. Ghost ghosted their flanks and then vanished, which felt like a blessing in a story, and Wyman Manderley met them on the quay with a smile that could buy 100 lies and pay for truth besides. "My Lord King," he boomed, and set his hands upon Jon's shoulders with a grandfather's possession. "I have a ship fat enough to carry your cause, and a cook who thinks fish should never be seen except baked in a pie. I can offer you pies or mercy. The choice is yours." "Mercy," Jon said dryly, and Manderley's laugh cracked the cold air open. On the water, winter had a different sound. Ice gathered along the ropes and cracked in thin shells they had to break with gloved hands. The sea built small knives and tossed them against the hull. Gulls wheeled and complained in a language that did not change with kings. Davos moved the way a man moves when the boards under his feet know his steps better than the land. He taught Jon how to stand with knees loose to let the world pitch beneath without taking him with it. At night, Davos told stories about smuggling onions into a starving castle and saving a lord who would later burn his daughter at a stake. He did not name him. He did not have to. Between his sentences lay the plain, hard truth. Men are nests for contradictions, and winter asks them to choose which ones to keep warm. Dragonstone rose from the fog like a thing once made by fire and then abandoned to ash. The cliffs stabbed the air. The carved dragons along the causeway looked as bored with time as mountains. Missandei met them with words as clear as water and as formal as a dance. Grey Worm watched without blinking. Tyrion waited at the foot of the steps with a smile that tried to be only a smile and failed. "Jon Snow," he called. "Here to steal my queen's rocks." "Here to borrow them," Jon returned, and they embraced like men hugging memories. Tyrion led him up, breath laboring because the steps were built to remind men that thrones were meant to be won with lungs and knees as much as with blood. Inside the great hall, Daenerys waited with a calm that looked like a mask on other women and like her face on her. The light through the high windows made a crown on air that refused to sit on any head. Jon took it all in and felt how the stone had been hewn to hold a hunger different from the godswoods. Fire had hands here still. The words were careful. They had to be. Dothraki guards shifted their weight in unison. Missandei's eyes made notes. Tyrion's elegant mouth worked like a man chewing a tart fruit. Daenerys listened. When she spoke, the room paid attention to a certain pitch in the air. "You say you are Aegon Targaryen," she said to Jon without looking away. "My brother's son." "I was named so," Jon answered. "I am the son of Lyanna Stark. My father is Rhaegar. The man who raised me is Eddard Stark." "I knew your father," Tyrion said softly. "He gave me honesty when men thought it a tax they could avoid." "Do you have proof?" Varys asked from the shadow, voice like cloth being folded. "Howland Reed's word," Jon said. "A priest's seal, and a boy who can see into the past like a net cast into a deep lake." Daenerys's face did not show relief or joy or any easy cousin to them. It showed the thought of a woman who had carried a claim like a shield through 10 deserts and had now been told that the shield had a twin. "My brother's son," she repeated, and the words were not tenderness and not threat. They were a new weight placed upon an already heavy thing. Then she breathed out, "None of that changes what I do today." "It changes some things," Tyrion murmured. "It changes nothing about the dead out of the north." Davos put in, and his voice did not bow to any crown. Your Grace. He included the title with the same respect he gave a well-built boat. Daenerys turned to him. Ser Davos. Just Davos, he said. I'm the sort of man titles get stuck to like burrs and never look right after. She smiled despite herself, quick and real. Davos, then. The North needs fire that doesn't take what it warms, Davos said. We need the stone under your feet. We need to dig it out and carve it into things we can put between our bellies and the cold night. Let us do that. Whatever dragons you have left over, we can talk about where they fly next. Daenerys looked at Jon. Will you bend the knee? No, he said, without pride and without apology. Not now. The men who follow me promise to follow a king who keeps their backs to a wall that doesn't catch fire. If I kneel, they kneel, and the kneeling breaks their spines. When we have survived what comes out of the north, I will speak to you as my father might have spoken to your brother. Until then, allow me to take stone from your island to make the knives I need. If you can spare fire, lend it north. If you wish to hear songs of your name on the wind, earn them in winter. Her eyes shone, not with anger, with hunger of a kind Jon recognized. The hunger to do a thing that mattered more than old names. She let the room hold silence, and then she nodded once, small and decisive. Mine the dragonglass, she said. Tyrion will arrange it. Missandei will see to the terms. I will lend you no dragon until I have seen the dead with my own eyes. Then you will see them, Jon said. The caves under Dragonstone were a cool breath after the hall's old heat. The black glass caught torchlight and returned it in thin blue praises along the edges. In the deepest curve of the cave, the walls wore pictures scraped by children with small sharp stones and long patience. Spirals, circles, stick figures holding hands with other stick figures that had eyes too bright to be men. Jon stood beside Daenerys and traced the line of a drawing that looked like men and white shadows standing against a tide of night. They fought together once, he said. Men and the children. Until they did not, Daenerys answered, and he could not tell whether she spoke of ancient enemies or of the dragons and the wolves looking at one another beside a wall they'd both claimed to own. He turned to her. I meant what I swore in the gods would. I will not burn the north to warm any man's throne. And I meant what I said in a desert, she answered. I will break chains. I do not free men to shackle them to fire. The first pickaxes went into the black stone that afternoon. The sound of mining became the heartbeat of a new thing. Methodical, ugly, necessary. Jon wrote to Sansa and told her what he had won and not won. She wrote back and told him what she had kept and not lost. He slept in a chamber that smelled of salt and old banners and dreamed of a wall he could not see over, even with dragon's eyes. The raven from Eastwatch did not ask permission to be urgent. It came in at dawn and beat its wings against Davos's chest as if to push him across the hall faster. Tormund's hand had never been good with a quill, but it was good enough to say the thing that mattered. The dead were moving in a line that could be measured by the time it took a man to freeze if he stood naked in a storm. We have to show them, Jon said. Not only Daenerys. Cersei. Every lord with a roof he thinks winter won't reach. Catch one, Davos said deadpan, as if he were suggesting a trick with a salmon. Put it in a bag. Bring it south, Jon said. Let them smell its breath. Tyrion pinched the bridge of his nose. I can only imagine what the King's Landing courtiers will do when presented with a corpse that refuses to keep a decent schedule. Better they piss themselves now than bleed later, Davos replied. They made an ugly plan, and ugly plans have a way of working. Jon would go north again with a handful of men who had learned how to be stubborn in the face of bad odds. Tormund, who loved the ice the way a man loves a wife he'd left and regretted. Jorah Mormont, returned from a death of another sort with new skin and an old sword. Beric Dondarrion, who had had too many chances to knock on a door and be told to go back. Thuras of Myr, drunk and pious, a blacksmith's son who had run fast enough once to save a king. Davos stayed because someone had to and because boats and smuggling and talking had grown into the same muscle in his chest. He would carry words to King's Landing while Jon carried a thing no words could hold. Sansa read the letter that told her he was going beyond the wall and did not sit down immediately. She went to the window and stood in the cold air as if it might teach her how to bear the next hours. Arya watched her and did not speak. Bran sat and said, "He will live," in a tone that turned a promise into a weather report. "Will he be whole?" Sansa asked. Bran considered. "He will be what he needs to be." "That is not the same thing," Sansa said, and kissed his crown and went to her work with the kind of ferocity that makes rooms warmer for a while. Littlefinger found the seam and pressed. He made sure Sansa received a note that could have been written by a child with a cold. A copy of a letter she had written to Robb years ago under a different crown, begging him to bend the knee to Joffrey to save their father. He placed it in Arya's path. He watched Arya's face turn winter different and was pleased. The thing he had not counted on was Bran. Sansa took Arya to the Godswood, and the three of them stood beneath the white face and the red leaves, and Bran recited facts with the blandness of snow sliding off a roof. He spoke of Littlefinger's dagger and the way it had first appeared at their father's side like a snake too slow to strike. He spoke of the whisper Peter had breathed into Ned Stark's ear in King's Landing years ago about the dagger and the Lannisters, and of the second whisper he had breathed into Lysa Arryn's ear that sent a letter north like a match toward dry thatch. He spoke of the moment on the moon door when Lysa had become heir. He spoke of the kiss Peter had placed on Sansa's mouth in a snowy courtyard in the Vale, unwanted and admitted, and Sansa did not flinch because shame belongs to the man who had held her face, not to her. Arya listened, and her eyes cooled from murder to justice. They called Peter Baelish to the hall. He came with the smile of a man who has rehearsed every possible speech and packed them in corresponding chests inside his chest. "Lord Baelish," Sansa said, voice level as the yard at dawn. "You are accused of treason against House Stark and murder of our Aunt Lysa Arryn, of betraying our father with lies and blade, of conspiring with our enemies to set this war singing. How do you answer?" He blinked, and for the first time since they had known him, surprise opened his face like a window accidentally unlatched. "There is no court for such accusations," he said. "Only a girl's anger and a child's fairy tales." Bran lifted his head. "You told our father that the dagger that cut his throat belonged to Tyrion Lannister," he said. "You told Aunt Lysa to poison her husband and blamed the Lannisters. You told our father, I did warn you not to trust me. You kissed Sansa in the snow and thought how she looked like her mother. Do you want me to say more?" Peter went pale in patches. He reached for Glover, for Serwyn, for any man who had once laughed with him over a cup. He reached for the Vale Knights he had bought with bread and fear. None of them moved. Sansa stepped down from the dais and the hush in the hall cracked under her feet. "You offered me a leash," she said very gently, "and told me it was a chain for other men. You taught me to think the worst of other people so that I would not see the worst of you. You killed the man who should have been my father's friend and told me it would keep me safe. You set wolves and lions to gnaw one another and told yourself the bones would be yours. You hurt me. You hurt my family. I will not let you hurt anyone in this hall again." He went to his knees. He tried to weep. He tried to find the boy in his face who had once looked up at a girl in a winter courtyard and had not been chosen. Sansa watched him and saw him for what he was, a man who had learned the wrong lessons from rejection and turned himself into a knife to make sure he would never need to hear no again. "Arya," she said, and the name was a judgment. Arya moved with the simple grace of a gesture completed, and the blade that had tried to be a story found its end in a throat it had helped to open long ago. It happened without drama. Men exhaled and looked at the floor. The hall felt cleaner, like a room after a fever has broken. Word came from the far north that night like a door flung by a wind. Jon and his handful had gone out onto a lake that dreamed itself solid and had found that dream a liar. They stood on a rock in the middle of a ring of dead men and watched an ice that remembered river learn to hold weight again. A raven rode south on a wind it should not have been able to outrun, and Davos put it on a boat with a message for a queen who had once sworn to break wheels. Daenerys flew north with 3 dragons because the old promise in her mouth was not enough when she imagined men she had invited into her hall dying under a sky she had not yet seen. She found Jon on a rock and death making a circle around him as if measuring his neck for a noose. Her dragons tore the circle open the way sunlight tears fog. The noise they made reminded the dead of something they had forgotten, the sound of a world before winter, and it frightened them enough to make them clumsy. Jon fought his way onto the back of Regal with one arm numb and the other stubborn and turned toward escape. Too late to be clean. The spear the Night King threw did not vibrate with rage when it flew. It moved with the certainty of a tool being used properly. It struck Viserion, and a sound came from the dragon like a bell hit once for a funeral. He fell in a curve of smoke and gold that burned the lake enough to weaken its memory and then went out. They lived. Thuras did not. Beric wept with the confusion of a man who had lost the priest who kept finding him. Jorah crawled back into himself enough to remember shame and then decided he had no time for it. Tormund cursed in a language only the wind understood. Jon sank into water that closed over his head like a mouth that had learned to swallow kings as easily as beggars, and a hand found his collar and dragged him out, and he breathed. The cold ate at him like a patient animal. He lost pieces of himself on the ride to the wall. They found enough left to be worth warming. Daenerys watched the place where Viserion had fallen and set her teeth so tight it hurt. At Eastwatch, she stood in a tower room and let the wind shove at her until it seemed almost like a god that might be argued with. When Jon woke, she went to him. He lay on a pallet with a blanket that could not be described as warm unless you had just ridden out of a lake of death. He reached for her hand because living chooses. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant not only the dragon. "I will fight the dead with you," she answered, and meant not only the dead. "I cannot have children," she added, as if the words needed to be set between them like a plate on a table so that nothing spilled. "I was dead," he said wryly. "Perhaps the rules will find they can be bent if they reach Winterfell." Some small, true sound came from her. Not a laugh, not a sob, not a plan. "Kneel," she whispered, and he shook his head because it was the old question. "I can't, but I can pledge myself to you," he said. "Not as a kneeling man with a crown in his hand, as a man with a wall at his back and a winter in his lungs. I can be your ally, your—" He looked for a word that had been polluted and could be cleaned. "Kin." She held his gaze. Aunt and nephew sounded like oddities in the mouths of Southron men, who had never had to keep a line unbroken through winter by marrying a cousin or trusting a sister's son with a house. On Dragonstone, the word had been used as a tool. Here it demanded to be an oath. "Kin," she repeated. "And if fire asks for more, then we will see what our gods allow," he said. They sailed south to crack open the stubborn heads in King's Landing with the one proof that might do it. Davos had run words through the city like a man testing locks. Tyrion had slipped in and out of shadows like a cat who remembered every kitchen it had ever raided. Cersei sat on her iron chair with a face that had been carved to look like disdain so long ago she could not make it look like anything else. Jaime stood at her shoulder like a man who had long ago decided which of his vows he would break and now found there were more to choose among. The white hissed in its box like a truth no one wanted. When they flung the lid open, it stumbled towards Cersei with its mouth in the wrong place and its hunger as honest as an open wound. The hound jerked it back and chopped it in half, and the top half crawled anyway like a private joke fate had made at their expense. Qyburn bent over it with a sparkle in his eye that made men step backward. Cersei did not flinch outwardly. Inwardly, her pride took the blow and immediately began sewing bandages that looked like plans. "We will not call a truce so you can fatten your enemies," she said, but her voice had lost a sliver of iron. "You will or you will die," Jon answered, and did not make it a threat. He looked at Jaime and saw the flicker there, the calculation of a man who had once killed a king to save a city and had been damned for it anyway. He looked at Cersei and saw a woman unable to imagine a world not centered upon her own gravity. He looked at the white and saw that none of this mattered if snow reached the sea before they had burned enough of it. They left with a promise that tasted like ash. Cersei would send men. Tyrion had watched her eyes and told them afterward there were snakes in those pupils. Jaime left her. He had already left her, he realized. The night he had looked at their child laid out and realized grief had grown selfish inside Cersei like another womb. He rode north in a cloak that did not know him and found winter on the road to teach him humility. The wall fell the way old things fall, with a sound that no new thing can describe. The dead dragon hauled a chain of frost across the sky and breathed a blue that ate stone cleanly and with purpose. Men stood on Eastwatch and watched a century's worth of nights collapse into a single, unbroken day of cold. Jon stood on the ramparts of Winterfell and felt the world tilt, not like a ship but like a map being turned by a different hand. He had returned before the fall. He had entered his hall and Sansa had looked at him, as if measuring where to set him in a room that had changed while he was gone. He had told her the thing about Daenerys and about their kinship, and she had not flinched because flinching belonged to girls and Winter had taken that from her. She had nodded and said it was good to have a woman with fire who would not set the roof alight. Arya had grinned like a knife in a sheath. Bran had said, "The dragon has holes where he should not," and no one had asked him to say more. Jaime arrived with frost in his hair and his gold hand hidden under a rag as if shame could be mouthed like a prayer and heard by gods. Brienne met him in the yard and looked at him as if he were a piece of iron she'd found at the bottom of a river. Bent, dulled, perhaps still useful if heated and hammered. He bowed badly because the stiffness in his shoulder had never fully left him and said, "My lady," as if it were a confession. "You came," she said, which was all the words the deed deserved. Samwell Tarly arrived with Gilly and a child and a satchel so full of papers that it had changed the way he walked. He smelled of dust and ink and perseverance. He found Jon in the library and put a book down with a soft thump, as if the book had been a bird and his hands had forgotten how to be gentle with living things. "You are Aegon," he said without preamble, because sometimes a man needed to hear the thing he had already said into his own mouth spoken from a friend's. Not just by a reed's word. Rhaegar had his marriage to Elia annulled by a septon and married Lyanna in a secret ceremony. I read it in a ledger while a boy cried and a girl learned to read words upside down, and I learned that the world would take a man's certainty and replace it with the kind of truth that hurts at first and then makes you breathe better. Jon laughed, surprised by the relief that found him even after all the knowing he had done. "Bran showed me," he said, "and Howland Reed told me. But thank you for bringing the parchment that men who do not kneel to trees prefer to see." Sam smiled, a little fierce and a little soft. It seemed wrong to let a thing stay where it was when it wanted to be here. Winterfell became a hive and then a heart. The smithy burned like a star through the short days. Men hammered dragonglass into arrowheads and daggers and a few brave, foolish swords. The gods would saw vows spoken and rage given to the snow. Daenerys came with 2 dragons and a face that had learned how to stand beside cold without pretending to love it. She moved through Winterfell with eyes that tried not to covet and hands that tried not to command. She watched Sansa with a wary admiration. Sansa watched her with a wary gratitude. They spoke quietly and often, and the men who hoped for a fire fed by women's competition found themselves eating cold bread instead. Gendry took the smithy like a man hugged by his old mother. Arya watched him from the doorway and smiled in a way that made Jon step lightly for a moment and think of all the little knots the gods tie into ropes to keep men from falling over cliffs. The Hound sat by the fire with his scarred face turned toward the heat like a pilgrim. Beric prayed under his breath without expecting anything to come of it and found his own voice a comfort. Yora walked the yard and did not look at Longclaw except to glance and be grateful. Bran spent long hours with his eyes pale and his hands lax, traveling the long white roads he alone could walk before the rest of them had to. "They are many," he said, and when Sansa asked how many he did not answer with a number, he answered with a gesture. He spread his hands apart until Sansa understood the space between them was smaller than the army coming. The first dark line appeared on the horizon like a stain that would not wash. The air changed. The silence changed. Men took their places atop the walls and in the yard and in the trenches dug along the outer field. They did not speak their names aloud because names were for after. Ghost paced the battlements, a white interruption in the honest black of the stones. Jon stood with Daenerys above the gate, and the wind did what it always does at such moments. Found every gap in armor and worried it like a dog. Sansa stood in the crypt with the women and the children and the men who would not be useful above ground. and she held Arya for a breath longer than her sister liked, and then let go. "Don't get killed," Arya said roughly, "because gentleness in such moments breaks." "You either," Sansa answered. The dead came as if they had been living all along in the folds of the land and had simply decided to stand up. The first whites fell to the trenches and burned. The second wave used the first to cross. Arrows sang and found their old work. Davos ran along the wall with flags to speak to dragons because fire understands banners better than it understands men's mouths. Daenerys and Jon mounted and took the sky. For a time, Winterfell became an old story about light and dark, told too often to surprise and still surprising because the dark always tries to be new. In the madness of snow and flame and the shriek of things that were never meant to know such heights, Jon saw the Night King. He rode as if the sky had been made only for him. His eyes were winter's answer to summer's arrogance. Jon Dove, regal, screamed. The world became a knot of wings and teeth and scales, and the old cracked blue that meant death taking a breath. Somewhere on the ground men died without being seen by the gods they prayed to. Somewhere in the crypt stone cracked like old bread. Somewhere Arya moved through hallways like a thought sharper than steel. Jon fell from the sky with the air knocked out of him, and the ground rose to meet him like an accusation. He lay for a heartbeat and watched his breath go up like a prayer only he could answer. He pulled himself up. He ran. He did not think. He did that rarest of things. He became the man his men had imagined when they called him king. He found the Night King in the Godswood, which felt like an insult to everything that was not made of winter. The blue of him made the red leaves look brighter. Jon lifted Longclaw and understood he was not the man for this particular end. The Night King mocked him with an unchanging face and raised his hand, and the dead rose around them like a choir that did not know mercy. Jon swung and parried and fought in a small circle of living because the living demand space. A shadow moved, not his and not the Night King's. A girl's shadow, a child of Winterfell, grown clever in the time it takes a bird to learn a new song. Arya flew the way a thought flies that has been held back too long and wants to see daylight. The dagger that had learned itself in Winterfell long before it learned the road went into the place where winter had left a softness. Just there, and the blue went out of the Night King like a breath. He shattered like a story told too often to men who know the ending. The dead fell with him, tidy all at once like wheat before a scythe. Silence hurt, pressed on men's eardrums like a sea. Snow drifted down, surprised to be only snow again. It took a long time to learn who was alive. Men moved through piles of bodies, and sometimes a hand would clutch at their ankle and they would lift the body and find a friend, and sometimes they would not. Jorah lay with his sword in his hand, and Daenerys knelt beside him and put her head to his chest and listened to what was not there and thanked him for the sound it had made so long as it could. Beric had finally found a door that would not open again for him. The hound sat and cried without sound because fire had been friend and enemy both, and now it was only heat and it hurt. Sansa came up out of the crypt with a face that had learned how to break and how not to in the same hour. She found Arya and held her, and neither of them spoke because words are cruel after such nights. Bran sat under the heart tree and blinked and returned, and when he looked at Jon his eyes were not a god's. They were a boy's, relieved to see his brother breathing. Ghost came limping, blood in the white fur, and pressed his head to Jon's thigh, and Jon put both hands into his ruff and did not care who watched him whisper a thank you to an animal who had saved more lives than many men with names. They burned the dead. They spoke the names they could remember. They spoke the names they could not remember to the snow and asked it to carry them. They slept the sleep that makes men wake up gasping and do it again. Weeks passed in the way weeks pass after war. Bills paid in sickness and new babies, and the way a room grows quiet when someone mentions a name that had been loud. Men returned to their houses. The dragons left their prints on the yard and the roof and the air. Daenerys looked south and saw the old will resting and hated it. Jon looked south and saw a debt waiting and wondered who would pay it. He and Daenerys walked the parapet one morning when the sun had learned how to be gentle again. From this angle, Winterfell looked less like a fortress and more like a patient old animal, lying with its head on its paws and relearning the art of sleeping unafraid. "My father meant for a better world," she said, "if he ever existed outside the songs." My father meant for a true one, Jon said. He would tell me truth is a better bed to sleep on than ambition. Ambition is a poor blanket, Daenerys agreed and then smiled sideways. Warm sometimes. He considered the south. Cersei will not give us peace. She will take every breath we leave in the room. She will, Daenerys said. But I no longer wish to rule over Ash. I find I wish to rule over men who laugh. Then perhaps we should let the North laugh where it likes, Jon said, and the idea did not sit on the parapet like a plan. It settled like a possibility. The North will not be chained again. Nor will I, Daenerys said, eyes on the horizon. But fire and ice can sit beside one another if the house is big enough. I could be queen of the South. You could be king of the North. We could be kin fiercely enough to frighten any man who wishes to test the door between. He looked at her then, and the look contained 100 roads men would try to draw on maps for them. It contained the gods would, and a woman naming him, and a dragon falling into a lake, and a hall full of men who had shouted his name not because they loved thrones but because they loved roofs that held. It contained Sansa's steady mouth and Arya's quick hands and Bran's far eyes and Ghost's breath and Davos's tired jokes and Lyanna Mormont's uncompromising chin. It contained a promise that had nothing to do with kneeling. We should speak with Sansa, he said, because the house would not stand if its lady did not agree. We should speak with the lords. We should speak with the people who bake the bread. We should speak slowly. Slowly? Daenerys echoed, and laughed at the novelty of the word in her mouth. That afternoon they called the hall. Winterfell filled once more with the sound of chairs and boots, and the low humming readiness of men, who had learned in the hardest way that their opinions mattered only as much as the hands they would put to work after. Sansa stood beside Jon. Daenerys stood a little apart, out of courtesy and out of wisdom. Tyrion and Davos flanked the room like old warnings placed where men could see them and choose anyway. Jon spoke. He did not call himself king at first. He did not call himself Aegon. He said Jon and Sun and Winter and Alive. He said, we held. And the hall settled around the fact of it as if around a fire. Then he said, the South remains. And men shifted like wolves smelling a new wind. Daenerys spoke next. She did not recite her titles. She said, I have seen what your winters do. And men heard in it respect they had not expected. I do not intend to claim what you held through a night I did not weather without you. I will take the South because the South has eaten itself for too long and it would be good for it to be fed rather than devoured. I ask you to be my allies, not my subjects. I ask you to let men pass between our lands with grain and iron and songs. Lyanna Mormont stood. Men breathed in as if bracing for the lash. If you try to sit your dragon on my hall, she told Daenerys, I'll have him skinned and make a fine roof. But if you bring me salt and pepper for my stew and let my men be men without asking them to put on silk, you may sit in my chair a day and say what you like. Daenerys bowed to her, the deference clean and not theatrical. Men looked at one another and some smiled because they liked a queen who could be scolded by a girl and not burst into flame. Glover rose, reluctantly and then with more conviction. My king is a Stark, he said, and then looked at Jon and revised. My king is the man who stood in the yard until his breath froze. He can call himself Targaryen if he likes. He can call himself Milk if he likes. He is ours. If the Dragon Queen leaves us our wolves, we will send her our fish and our axes when she asks. So long as she asks. Manderly's son made a quick calculation and tallied up bread and ships and pride and found the sums bearable. White Harbor will build boats for your southern wars if the southern wars feed our winter, he promised. And if the Dragon Queen promises never to burn my larders. Daenerys smiled. Rye, I will burn only what asks to be burned, she said. The vote, if it could be called that, was more the settling of a house after a storm. No man knelt. No man demanded kneeling. The North would stand. The South would be taken. The door between would be guarded by wolves and opened when ships came and closed when armies considered a march. It was a plan that would make men call them cowards and radicals and fools, depending on which wine had been poured. It was the plan they had, which is always the best kind. As the hall emptied, Arya came to Jon and nudged him with an elbow. King in the north and not on the Iron Throne, she teased. You always did like the cold better. Frost suits your ugly face. He pretended to be wounded. Sister, your love embarrasses me in front of my friends. She grinned, then glanced down to where Gendry, soot-streaked and pleased with himself, stood trying to look like a man who did not want to speak to a girl very badly. Some of us have other plans, she said, and flitted away like a shadow given laughter. Sansa drew Jon into the Godswood. They stood under the face and listened to the drip of melt from the last of the snow gathered in the heart tree's crooks. You will marry her, she said without preamble, as blunt as a blade laid on a table. If we do not need to, we should not, he said. We are kin and allies. We need not be more. It makes things easier for men who want to draw us into one shape and pry us apart later. Sansa considered this and found it good. Then do not. If one day your hearts are too large for 2 separate rooms, we will build a doorway. If not, then you will stand in your rooms and wave. The North will still be the North. He looked at her, and the gratitude rose up like tide. You have become what Winterfell needed, he said. I am proud of that in a way I do not know how to speak. Speak it badly, she advised, smiling. It still warms. They stood together a long while, and the tree listened. The ravens in the rookery talked about grain. The smithy sang. The dragons slept on the warm stones where the cook's fires vented. One eye open because dragons remember everything men forget. When the snows finally began to rot at the edges and spring put hesitant fingers into the fields, the first ship set out from White Harbor with bolts of cloth and a keg of salted herring and a letter tucked into a cask with beeswax, addressed to a queen in the south. It said only, "We will come when the ground can hold our feet. Do not break it before we arrive." It was signed with a wolf and a dragon sketched by a child whose hand had learned, this winter, to be sure. Cersei, of course, would break anything she could rest her weight on. But that would be a different winter and a different fire. For the moment the North breathed, and the house settled, and the wolves learned the new ways through old corridors. Jon walked the walls and the gardens and the halls, and sometimes the words in his mouth were Aegon, and sometimes they were Jon. And either way he answered when men called and was not precious about which name they used. Ghost followed him. Sansa's laughter found the great hall again, not often, but enough to teach the walls how to hold it. Arya came and went in the way shadows do at dusk and dawn. Bran sat under the tree and knew too much and sometimes let himself forget for a few minutes and watched a raven like a boy might. Daenerys rode south when the roads promised to hold a horse and not eat it. Her parting from Winterfell had none of the hot urgency of a romance staged for bards. It was steadier and more intimate. She stood with Jon under the gate while the wind threaded their hair and said, "If I die, do not let my dragons be caged." He said, "If I die, tell them I did not apologize for living." They kissed because life had given them the right. They did not promise more than they could keep. They did not promise less. After she left, a small boy ran up to Jon in the yard and showed him a carved horse with legs uneven. "I made it," he announced. "It stands only if you put it on its wrong leg first." "Most of us do," Jon said. He crouched and took the horse and turned it over in his hands and thought of all the wrong legs he had stood on first. He handed it back gently, as if it were a banner. At night, in the quiet that comes after men have spoken and beds have been found, Jon stood in the crypt and read stone faces. He paused before Ned Stark's and thought of a promise kept too well and then kept well enough. He paused before Lyanna's and thought of a name spoken into air like a spell. He paused before Robb's and let grief prick him like a thorn that never dulled. He laid a hand on the cold wolf at each statue's feet. The stone did not warm. He did not ask it to. Above, the sky began to remember how to be blue. In the south, a queen sharpened her crown until it cut her and did not mind the blood. In the east, ships loaded with grain and forged blades and stubborn songs tacked into winds that had names men had forgotten. In the neck, a man walked into a fog and spoke to a woman who stirred a pot that boiled and told him what the frogs had said. In the Iron Islands, a girl stood on a prow and breathed salt and swore to learn a better way to rule than her uncle's way. In the Vale, a boy learned, for the first time, to stand without a hand holding his elbow. Winterfell stood. The Heart Tree watched, pleased in the only way a tree can be. And Jon Aegon, king and bastard and son, went about the work he had chosen for himself, to be wall and door and hearth. The winter had taught him which names mattered when the cold pressed closest. The spring would teach him which promises could be kept in a world where men were as fickle as weather and as stubborn as stone. He had Ghost beside him, and Sansa's counsel, and Arya's shadow, and Bran's far sight, and Davos's weary faith. He had a dragon's wind in his lungs sometimes, and fire under his ribs. He had a house that said his name back to him at night when he said it to himself in either shape and meant it. The snow in the yard turned to slush that soaked the leather of his boots. He smiled because it made him feel like a boy again. He looked south, where war hummed like a hive. He looked north, where the world had ended and begun again. He lifted his face to the thin, cautious sun and let it warm the scar on his throat. Then he went down into the yard where men were waiting to be told what to do next, and he told them, and they did it, and Winterfell still held.